How many times have you gone out to photograph birds and you come across some white birds, maybe like a great white egret, and you take a picture of it and you get back to the editing room later on and you're like, what is happening here? My pictures of white birds just have no detail. Can't really make out the feathers. I really can't make out any kind of fur that's going on this bird. What am I doing wrong? Is this something that you struggle with? Is this something that frustrates you? Because if it is, you're not alone. This is one of the biggest challenges for wildlife photographers. And today we're going to talk about this because a viewer by the name of Andrew asked me a question recently in the comments. And so I wanted to make a video to kind of talk about this because I know that when I'm out in the field photographing white birds, I give a lot of extra attention to what I'm doing to make sure that I get good exposures on them so that I can make sure that I preserve the details in those fur and feather areas. That's what we're going to talk about today. So stay tuned because there's a lot of information to cover in today's show. Hey, I'm Jeff from Magnolia Photography SC, professional wildlife photographer in Charleston, South Carolina. If you're new to the channel, I want to welcome you in. And if you're returning to the channel, I want to welcome you back as we talk about one of the most challenging aspects of wildlife photography, photographing white birds, and how do we go about preserving the detail in their feathers and their fur structures? That is the question on the table today. In fact, Andrew from Australia submitted a comment, as I mentioned at the top of the show, and I want to take a look at that quickly to see what he is asking. So let's pull that up and take a look at Andrew's question. Good day from Australia. I was hoping you might be able to take us through a photo that is taken in high sunlight conditions, right? Midday in summer, where colors appear to be a bit saturated and there might be a little heat haze. I'm struggling trying to get good DxO images out of the photos I have taken of mud skippers in a swamp during the hottest part of the day when the sun was overhead. Same goes for egrets. Bloody hard with all of the white feathers and bright sunlight. The spectrum of light is far from optimal, but there has to be a workaround, right? Well, Andrew, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but the answer to your question is it really depends. And I know that we have this answer a lot in photography, but the truth of the matter is it does depend. It depends on how much you overexpose your image. Now, I'm not familiar with what a mud skipper is exactly, so I would love to see a picture of that at some point. But obviously, I'm very familiar with egrets. So let's talk about this for a second, right? Like I said, it depends on how overexposed the image is. I know this is going to be hard to hear, but there are going to be times when we overexpose the image to a point where the information is not recoverable. The detail of the feathers, of the fur, whatever the case may be, it's not going to be recoverable because we're going to clip or blow out those highlights. And at that point, there's just nothing we can do. There's no magic bullet. There's no special tool, right? No special slider inside of any photo editing software that's going to help us recover this. So the truth of the matter is if we really want to get the most out of our photo editing, if we want to have a lot of flexibility and a lot of options available to us in our photo editing software, it all starts with image capture. So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about how we can get more detail in our white birds or even birds that have brighter colors, right? Sometimes we have birds that will have a white chest, or maybe they'll have white parts of their fur or feathers. Or maybe they have some other brighter colors that can be difficult to expose for. So we're going to be talking about those types of things today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we need to do and what we need to think about as far as camera settings. Then I'm going to take you inside of DxO Photolab 9 and show you some examples of my photos. I'm going to show you a photo that I absolutely destroyed because of my careless exposure. And then I'm also going to show you another photo that kind of falls somewhere in the middle. And then I'm going to show you lastly a photo that is very well exposed. And we're going to take a look at what this means from an editing standpoint and what we can do in the editing process to maximize the detail of these types of images. So let's talk about camera settings first. First things right off the rip is that we need to be shooting in the raw file format. If you're shooting in JPEG, you are going to limit your dynamic range and you are going to limit what you can do later on in the editing process because of that compression that takes place on a JPEG image. So that's the first thing. And I don't know what you're shooting in, Andrew. You didn't mention that in your question, but if you're shooting in JPEG, I highly recommend that you get away from that as quickly as possible and get to that raw file format so that you can capture more of the information in the scene. You're going to have more dynamic range and you're going to have a ton more flexibility when you get to your editing program. So that's really step one. The next thing that I would recommend to you is, how do you have your metering mode set up? One of the first things that I would do is look at your camera and see what options you have available. It's all going to depend on your make and model and how old your camera is. Now, what I would typically choose on my camera when I'm really trying to focus on getting a good exposure on a white bird, obviously the white bird then becomes our priority. And usually our subject is our priority, but because they're so difficult to expose for, it has even more of a premium when it comes to the priority of this subject. So what I'm going to be looking to do is switch my light metering mode either to a spot metering or to a highlight metering. And that's just going to really help us to ensure that we are exposing for the brightest part of the image, and it helps us to get a better exposure. Now, of course, we're going to have little trade-offs along the way, and we have to kind of keep that in mind, right? If we're going to prioritize this white bird, and we're going to put all the focus on getting the exposure there good, which is really what we want to do usually, that means that the background and the surrounding areas are typically going to go a little bit darker, right? Because we're going to have to either use a faster shutter speed or maybe use a deeper depth of field. And when we do that, we're going to allow less light into the camera, and it's going to make the background and the scenes around our subject darker. That's okay. We can always lift those shadows later on, assuming that we don't get too crazy and out of control with how dark we make the image. But that is generally on a high level what we are looking to do. So again, raw images, and really choose a good light metering mode that prioritizes the exposure on your subject. Now, what about shooting modes? Is there a particular shooting mode that you should be using? Shutter speed priority, or maybe aperture priority, or perhaps even manual? Now, I know manual scares a lot of people, but quite honestly, I think it's the easiest of the modes to use, and we'll circle back to that in a second. Let's talk about shutter speed and aperture priority. First thing that you're going to want to do here is obviously pick whatever one you feel most comfortable shooting in. Whatever one you choose is absolutely fine. But what we need to keep in mind is that the camera is going to be making some choices for us in those semi-automatic modes. That means when we're using those modes, exposure compensation is going to be one of our best friends. The idea behind getting a good exposure on a white bird, right? Generally speaking, we might be looking to get that exposure around the 0 mark on our light meter, right? That gives us, in general terms, a well-balanced exposure. But when we're photographing brighter subjects like that, sometimes if we get that meter to 0, to read 0 on the light meter, what winds up happening is our subject suddenly becomes too bright, sometimes even overexposed to the point, like I said earlier in the video, where we're clipping the highlights. We're blowing out those highlights. And the minute we do that is the minute we lose all the detail in those areas. So this becomes kind of crucial to watch your camera's light meter and see where it's falling from an exposure standpoint. It's all going to depend too on how bright your scene is. Are you photographing a white bird with a cloudless sky and the sun is just beating down and it's pretty harsh? Well, you might need to go 2 or 3 stops underexposed so that you can get a decent exposure on your subject. Perhaps the sun is out, but maybe you have some clouds helping to filter that sunlight a little bit. Well, maybe you can stop that down to maybe 1 to 2 stops underexposed, and that will give you a good exposure on your white bird. So those are some things that you're going to want to keep in mind. That's where exposure compensation is going to come in very handy when using shutter speed priority or aperture priority. go ahead and set your shutter speed or set your aperture, whatever one you're using. Let the camera control the setting that it's going to be controlling. And you can use your ISO as you see fit for the scene, whatever you want to do. Remember though, ISO, do not be afraid to use a little higher ISO if need be, right? It's not what's causing the noise in your image, it's lack of light. So the lack of light is going to come from our choice of shutter speed and aperture and how much light we are allowing into the sensor or how much light we are not allowing into the sensor. That is what's going to control the noise in our images. So as you go ahead and set those settings in shutter or aperture priority, just remember your last adjustment is probably going to come with exposure compensation because your camera is going to be helping you to get that exposure to around that 0 mark on your light meter. Once you're there, then go ahead and take that exposure compensation and darken down the image until you're 1, 2, or maybe even a little bit more underexposed. That's going to help control the brightness of those whites when photographing a white bird. Let's talk about that manual mode because that's my favorite. And like I said, I find this to be the easiest. So if I'm out photographing a white bird on a sunny day, first thing I'm going to do is set my aperture. Now, I use a couple of different lenses. Both of them are variable aperture lenses. So all I do is set my aperture to the widest aperture that it's going to let me. That's either 5.6 or 6.3, depending on the lens that I'm using. Now, as I zoom in with each of those lenses, the aperture is going to change. So it might go on the 200 to 600 lens, it might go to an f6.3 at the max. And if I go to the 400 to 800 lens, if I'm at 800 millimeters, the fastest I can use at that point is an f8. So that is fine. I'm not worried about that. What I'm worried about is just making sure that I set it to the widest aperture to photograph those white birds. And then, like I said, I set it and forget it. From there, I'm going to set my shutter speed based on the action that I'm expecting. Am I photographing a static bird or am I photographing a flying bird, right? This obviously makes a big difference where we have our shutter speed. If you've got a static bird, you can probably use a shutter speed of some sort under 1/1000 of a second. And you may need a supportive device if you're doing that. That'll be up to what kind of lens you're using, how good you are at hand holding, and all of those things. But again, general rules, you might be able to get away with 1/500 or somewhere between that and 1/1000. Now, if the bird is flying, of course, we're probably going to need a faster shutter speed. If it's a bigger bird, well, we probably can get away with 1/1600 or 1/2000. And then if we have a small bird like a belted kingfisher, that's a fast flyer and can be erratic at sometimes, their size is very small, right? So we're going to have to look at a shutter speed of like 1/2500, maybe 1/3200, so that we can ensure that we're going to freeze the action. Now that's just looking at shutter speed from an action standpoint. Now we got to throw into the mix the fact that we're photographing that white bird. Now we're going to have to make that shutter speed even faster so that we get to that underexposed image that we want, right? Depending on how much light, again, it could be 1 stop, 2 stops, maybe even 3 stops or more underexposed to make sure that we don't lose any detail in those highlights. What I'm going to do with my ISO is really just set that based on the light in the scene. If I'm out in the daylight and I'm photographing a bird in the shade, I might have my ISO at maybe 800 or 1000. If it's a real bright sunny day, I might have it a little bit lower, like 400. If we're in the shade and it's even darker than the previous scene we were just talking about, I might even go up to like 2000, right? I don't really worry about my ISO. That's really just helping me to kind of tweak and fine tune the brightness of my image. What I'm most worried about is just getting an ISO in the general range for the lighting that we have. And then I'm going to control my exposure with my shutter speed. So it's pretty simple when it comes down to using manual mode. You can see we're really not adjusting anything much more than using shutter speed priority or aperture priority. We're going to set that aperture and leave it. We're pretty much going to set the ISO and leave it for the most part. We may make a few tweaks here or there as the shooting conditions change, but most of the control is going to come from our choice of shutter speed for the action and also for the exposure that we want on our subject. So those are the things that I am thinking about when it comes to camera settings. What I want to do now is I want to jump into DxO Photolab 9, talk about some examples, show you some examples of images that I mentioned earlier in the show. And hopefully this will tie everything together once we see the visual with what we've been talking about so far. So let's jump in and take a look. Okay, welcome into Photolab here. Let's take a look at this first picture. This is of a couple of white ibises that we have here. And for those of you who are maybe a little bit more experienced in photography, I'm sure the error that I made, the careless error that I made with exposure here that destroyed my photo is pretty obvious to you. Now, for those of you who might be newer to photography, there might be something glaring out to you, but it just may not really kind of connect as to why it's happening or what's going on. And that's what I really want to talk about. If we look at this white ibis, these two white ibises, I should say, right? It's kind of in a shaded area, but what we can see and what we can tell here is that we also have some sunlight filtering through the trees. And we can see that obviously by the bright spots that are back here in the pine needles, right? We just see a little bit of a dappled sunlight, if you will. And then of course, we can see the big obvious glaring white spot here, hot spot on this white ibis on the front left. Now, again, this was very careless of me to not get the exposure right here. And I look at this photo and I'm just like, God, Jeff, you're just so dumb, right? Like, I should know better than this, right? I've been doing this for a long time and I should know better as to where I need to expose this image. When you're in this situation, right, it can be tough with wildlife photography because things happen so quickly and we often see a photo opportunity and we rush, right? We rush to get the shot for fear that the moment might be over or the subject might flee the scene or whatever the case may be. And it happens to even us professionals at time, and it happened to me right here. So I completely blew the exposure here and completely destroyed this image. And I love the little yawn that he's doing, right? Kind of facing the camera a little bit. I like that little facial expression. But man, did I blow this exposure. So what I should have done here is I should have underexposed this image and exposed more for that hotspot in the image. Now the question becomes, because this is pretty bright, this is pretty overexposed, and if we kind of look at what it would take to bring that hotspot back into it's really kind of tough to get it there. But if I try to bring down the exposure, to bring down the detail, to kind of try to get some details back into that fur, there is some detail that is lost and we can kind of see that, right? There's some spots that it's just still really bright and we're not seeing any structure. We're not seeing any texture, right? Nothing is really there. It's just kind of white and smooth. So we kind of blew that a little bit, as we know. But you can see that we were able to capture some of the detail in those feathers and fur, whatever you want to call it. But look at what it did to the rest of the scene, right? I mean, this is absurdly underexposed right now. So let's think about this for a second. If I had exposed for this photo out in the field, it probably would have looked something similar to this, right? In order to try to save those details in the hotspot. But what we would have actually had here is a little bit of problem, a big problem probably with noise in our image, because this would be a great example of starving our camera for light, right? Between the aperture and the shutter speed, if we create an image this dark, the minute we raise that exposure and the minute we raise those shadows, we're going to get more noise in that image because we just did not allow enough light, enough photons into our camera sensor. So that would be one issue. The other issue, of course, is this is really dark. And so if we had captured this image in camera like this, we may really struggle to raise the exposure and raise those shadows to a point where we can get sufficient enough detail to have a usable picture. This probably is just one of those photos where it's probably just a bad opportunity, a bad situation. It really wasn't that great to capture the image. But that's just the way it goes sometimes. But there's really nothing that we can do to fix this, because I have blown out those highlights so bad. And that, Andrew, is kind of what I was mentioning in the beginning of the show. If we clip the highlights, if we blow out the highlights so bad that we have really killed the detail in that area, this is where there's no magic button, no magic slider. There's nothing we can do. Even trying to do a local adjustment here is not going to do anything. If we were to kind of come in and try to say, okay, if I want to, maybe paint over this area, I'm not going to do the whole area. I'm just going to do something quick here, just for the sake of this video. But if we tried to say, okay, well, maybe if I did this, I could just try to do a local adjustment maybe to bring back some of those details. What you're going to see is that we just start to get a real kind of funky looking effect when we try to do that. And we get these dark lines right along the edge where we have, right, the discrepancy where our mask is, and where we have that discrepancy between detail and the photo being overly bright. So it doesn't really work out very well when we're trying to recover an area that is so blown out. So that is just something to keep in mind, right? Our editing opportunities with these types of photos are severely, severely limited. But let's take a look at the next photo. This is going to be one that I took of a flying bird, right? So this becomes very challenging because, if we have that static bird situation like I was talking about, right, we can kind of, put our focusing point and our light meter, on that brightest point and try to dial in the exposure. We have a lot more opportunity to be able to do that. But if we're photographing a flying bird, it's hard enough trying to track the bird, let alone trying to get the light meter on the brightest part of the image so we can try to get a proper exposure, right? That's pretty much impossible. So you can see in this photo, right, we have some bright spots. It's right around here on the back, up here on the head, and down the back side of the head, and even over here on the right side of the wing. Now, what we could do is we could go over here to our histogram and turn on the highlight warning. The good news is we haven't lost any detail, right? There's no highlight warnings coming up here. But watch what happens when I edit this photo, because I underexpose this photo. This is about 2 stops underexposed. If we were to adjust our exposure and get our histogram over here in the upper left-hand corner to move more towards the center of the histogram itself, right, we would see that we roughly have about 2 stops of exposure underexposed here to get that bird where we preserve the details of the feathers and the fur. So that's what we're really looking at. And you can see as we do that, well, we start to lose detail in our subject. That's why we underexposed it. So if we just bring that back, here's where we started, and then here's where my image finishes. Now, if I, we'll keep the highlight warning on here. And what we're going to see is that we have some areas with some loss of detail. Now, I don't mind it in this photo, and let me show you kind of what I'm thinking about as I'm looking at this photo. Sometimes it's impossible to get rid of every bright spot on a white bird, and this is kind of a case in point here. If I turn this off, this is how I'm viewing this bird, right? I'm seeing this whole wing structure. And we have these kind of like these cream feathers, and then we have the white feathers, right? And what I'm seeing though is I can make out all of the feather details, even though they may be a little bit bright. So as a viewer, I'm seeing structure here. I'm seeing the feathers. So I'm not thinking, oh boy, that's really bright and there's a real loss of detail, because there's not. The way it's playing out, I can see the feathers, and to me, it looks like it has a lot of detail. It just looks like this particular wing is being backlit by our lighting source. Same thing kind of happens over here on the right side, right? In the back part of the wing, we have some bright white, but we were also able to get a lot of detail out of the feather structure over here. And here's what kind of helps too. The part with the detail is closest to the camera. So that tends to grab the viewer's attention because it's closer to them as far as when they're viewing it. So we're getting good detail out of the wings. That really helps us. The other thing that helps to minimize the bright spots on this bird is we have a good exposure on the face, the neck, and this part of the belly that goes, underneath the bird, right? So that's all good there. So we're able to get a lot of detail out of these 3 sections, even though there are some areas that are a little bright. Now let's talk about editing, right? On the last one, we had that spot blowing out. There's nothing we can do. This one though, we can work this a little bit differently. So I'm gonna go back to the raw image and I wanna take a look at what I'm thinking here, right? So the first thing that I might do is just bump up the exposure of the image overall a little bit, just a little bit, right? So I'm gonna go up maybe about 0.60, a little over half a stop there in far as overall brightness. And the other tool that I would use is DxO Smart Lighting, because this does such a good job of adjusting exposures and adjusting parts, the shadows and the bright parts. It does just such a really, really good job. So I might even raise that, and I'll keep that at about plus 30. So this kind of gives us our starting point. But what we're going to do now is we're going to go in and we're going to start using some local adjustments to really make some fine-tuned edits to our subject. So I'm going to take this brush right here. This is the auto brush where it has the edge detection. The one thing we don't want to do is select the whole bird and do a global edit on the bird, if you will, right? We don't want to edit the whole bird the same way, because the wing on the right is different than the wing on the left, and the lighting on the body is a little different than both of those wings as well. So we kind of have three different areas with three different illumination values, if you will. So we want to edit them individually so we can fine tune each one and really hone in the exposure of our subject. So first thing I would do is come in and take a local adjustment here. Again, this auto mask brush with the edge detection. And I'm just going to do this real quick for the sake of this video. And, you know, I might bring down the highlights a little bit here, just so that we can kind of get some of that backlit effect working well. I might reduce that a little bit. Might even add in a little yellow because we know it's being kissed by the sun a little bit. I'll bump up the DxO Clearview Plus. This gives us a little more structure, a little bit more contrast to the wing, and that'll bring out and enhance some of the detail in the wing. I'm also going to add in some micro contrast. I'll bring this up to about 60, because that's going to do the same thing. It's going to kind of help work our exposure a little bit. It's also going to add some more detail into the area, and it just serves the image really well. So hypothetically speaking, I would do those types of adjustments, right? Little exposure bump, then some tweaks with highlights and midtones. We could even work the shadows and highlights a little bit and fine tune those to where we want them. But then adding some DxO Clearview Plus, adding some micro contrast, and just a little bit of warmth to the wing will really go a long way in maximizing the detail there. I'm then going to do another mask, and I would go to this wing, and I would go through and repeat the exact same process. Once I'm done there, I'm going to add another mask, and I'm going to do this part of the bird, right? And so this is what I'm going to do. It's just going to be rinse and repeat, right? I'm going to keep adding these masks. I'm going to keep tweaking these sliders until I get that exposure and pull out some detail in my subject. But we're going to have very little spots here, these little slivers, as I mentioned, on the back and on the head, where they're going to have a little loss of detail once we get the exposure to where we want it. I'm okay with that, because 95, 98% of the bird is going to have structure. It's going to have detail. It's going to look good to the viewer. I'm good there. Let's take a look at our last example. This is one where here is the raw file and here is the edited file. So let me just mark this actually as, we'll use this as the image reference, and then we will do a little compare here. And I'm going to put in the raw file in there too. And what I want to do is I just kind of want to zoom in here on these two images. So that again is the raw file. This is the edited one right here. And what I really want you to pay attention to is look at the histogram up here, right? There's nothing about this histogram where we have an overexposed area or an area that's too bright. So what that means is that we've gotten a good exposure on the bird. Now we're just going to use our editing tools like I just showed you, just to maximize the detail in our subject. If we look at the raw file, the area that I'm looking at is right here on the chest, right? It's a little white. We're not seeing a ton of detail there, but we know it's there because we didn't we didn't clip the highlights. We didn't blow out the highlights. So we know that we preserved the detail. We just got to pull it out with our editing tools. And you can see that when we come over here and we look at the edited photo, that's exactly what we did. Now you can see we have a lot of texture and detail going on in the bird's fur and feathers, right? So it really, really looks good. Now you could edit this a couple different ways. What I would probably do is I could either select the whole bird, but if you didn't want to have the beak or the legs affected, then you could just use that edge detection brush that I was just using and just paint over the white parts of the bird real quickly and then apply the edits. Again, work the highlights, work the midtones, use DxO Clearview Plus to help bring a little bit more texture and a little bit more contrast. Use the micro contrast that will really help to bring out a little bit more detail in those feathers, and then just tweak it and massage it until you get it to the point that you're happy with it. This is where we can use editing to our advantage. If we expose well enough, if we don't overexpose and we don't lose detail, then we have a ton of options in editing. But if we go back to that first image where I completely destroyed the highlight, well, we are SOL, my friends, because now we have nothing to work with. We have just sacrificed all the detail in those areas. So guys, this is how we go about preserving the details in white birds when we are out in the field. These are the things you can do. I hope you found this helpful. I hope you pulled a little something out of this. Andrew, I hope this answers your question today and helps you next time you're out in the midday sun to get better exposures on your subject, and maybe some things you can do in the editing once you have some better exposures to create better images. Thanks so much for stopping by, guys. If you want to learn more about wildlife photography, head on over to magnoliaphotographysc.com/store, where I have both free and paid resources to help you along your journey of learning wildlife photography. If you have DxO Photolab 8 and you're new to the program, or you've been using it for a while but just want to improve your skills, check out my DxO Photolab 8 Masterclass. If you've purchased the recent new version of DxO, the Photolab 9, I will be putting out a new class in the near future. I will, of course, let you know when that is available, but that will be coming very shortly too. So like I said, keep an eye out for that. And pick it up if you want to learn a lot more about DxO Photolab. Other than that, thank you so much. Hey, before you go, you know what you might want to check out? This next video.